Hello, I'm launching a series of videos, lectures on various countries of geopolitical importance across the world. We will essentially discuss the idea of geography behind each of major state, and the first such country is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Well, Iran is essentially a fortress state. By that I mean the heartland of the Iranian state is surrounded essentially by major geographic barriers. So to the north we've got the Caspian Sea and the Elburz Mountains. To the west, more or less along the entire border with Turkey and most of Iraq. Iran has Zagros Mountains. To the north, it's water again, the Persian Gulf and essentially the Arabian Sea. And to the east, we have more or less arid land, which makes the territory very hard for habitation. Obviously, the heartland of Iranian state is also crisscrossed with various geographic barriers, from desert to mountains and then to rivers, but more or less this heartland, which always served as a essentially as a center of Iranian civilization and as a center of various Iranian projects, state projects, essentially now serves again as a basis for what nowadays constitutes the Islamic Republic of Iran. But this essentially geographic barriers serve two purposes. So first, of course, is that Iran has defensive barriers. Essentially, it's very hard for a foreign actor, and essentially it has been very hard for a foreign actor to actually penetrate the heartland of Iran. And in terms of defense, that's always served as a major advantage. Indeed, if we look at the history of Iran, we see that invading Iran was possible, but maintaining control over Iran was almost always doomed to fail. We've got numerous examples, from Alexander the Great to the Mongols to Timur-Lenk or Tamerlan and others, essentially invading, maintaining control, but only for a very short period of time, and then essentially failing to prolong the rule beyond the immediate success. So essentially Iran, which historically has been relatively poor in comparison with the Chinese states, with the Indian civilization or the Ottoman state, exactly because of the geographic essentially features, it nevertheless was easily defensible from all the sides against foreign invaders. At the same time, this defensive purpose of the geographic barriers served as a negative factor too. That was exactly because of those defensive barriers that the Iranian dynasties always found it difficult to actually go beyond the mountains and rivers and gorges and seas and deserts, to invade and to expand their power beyond the Iranian plateau. So if we look at the history of Iran, we see that those projects, perhaps the Achaemenid project was the most successful, but after that, all the dynasties emanating from the Iranian plateau always faced tremendous difficulties in projecting their power beyond the geographic barriers we enumerated. So those geographic features essentially had dual effect on the history of the Iranian statehood. But if we look again at the geographic situation of the country, we also see that though it has this capacity to be defended by mountains and seas, we also see that Iran's position is essentially at the crossroads of the Eurasian trade routes. So Iran served as a major highway between East and West, essentially between Iran, China, and Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. And that always allowed Iran to be an important actor on the Eurasian map, not only in terms of the military capacity, but also in terms of transit, trade, and what we often refer to as Silk Roads. For example, if we take the late antique or period or even medieval period, we see how the Iranian dynasties essentially used their very good geographic position as a connector between several economic systems to actually pressure their rivals to the west, whether it was the Roman Empire, later the Byzantines, or the Ottomans in late medieval period. So in that sense, Iran was at the crossroads of commercial routes which passed through Eurasia at various periods of history. But at the same time, you see that still Iran's position was not that comfortable as, for example, the Ottomans, or before them Byzantines, or even before them the Romans enjoyed in the Mediterranean world, or what the Indian and Chinese civilizations had in their respective geographic areas. So the thing here is that Iran's position, or Iranian geography, actually limited the economic capacity of the country, and that always put Iran at a disadvantage. Essentially, the Ottomans, Indian civilization, or the Chinese, they were more opulent than the Iranian dynasties. In that case, for example, the Safavid dynasty from early 16th century till early 18th. So the idea is that Iran's geography again had a dual effect on the country. But to improve their geographic position, the Iranian leadership always sought to export their power beyond the immediate borders, to essentially look beyond the geographic barriers. This projection of power began from the Achaemenid period, and as we said, that was perhaps the most successful Iranian project, which essentially united India with the Mediterranean world, Central Asia with the Mediterranean world, Persian Gulf with the Central Asia, and again the Mediterranean world. So essentially those all major trade routes fell under the Achaemenid control. That was imitated by later, or at least the later Iranian dynasties tried to imitate this success. Perhaps the most successful was the Sasanian dynasty, when in early 7th century essentially managed to replicate what the Achaemenid Empire once was, but that was only for a very short period of time when the Byzantines managed to recapture the lost territories before the Arab conquest began. But the idea here is that to mitigate the limits on their resources in the Iranian plateau, the Iranian leadership, the Iranian dynasty essentially always sought to project power beyond the Zagros Mountains to the west, to essentially seek additional resources. And one of the major directions essentially in their efforts was the Mediterranean world. So the corridor from the Iranian plateau to the Mediterranean Sea was the single biggest essentially goal of the Iranian dynasties to achieve bigger economic success in terms of controlling trade routes, ports and goods, and essentially turning the empire into a wealthy state. So in that sense, we see what Iranian dynasties wanted in earlier centuries, and we could even argue that some of the patterns actually persist to the present period. Indeed, if we look at what the modern Iranian state tries to achieve in the Middle East, we see the more or less similar pattern with what we had in earlier millennia. So essentially, the Iranian goal of achieving a corridor through Iraq to Syria to the Mediterranean world, to the Mediterranean Sea nowadays, is a replication of the older pattern of what the Achaemenids and later the Sasanian rulers managed to achieve, even though only for a short period of time. So the Mediterranean world, it's there where we have resources, where we have trade, and where it's more possible to essentially expand your geopolitical calculus, to increase your geopolitical weight on the global arena, and essentially that's what the Iranian leadership nowadays tries to achieve. In that sense, you see the tools the Iranian leadership nowadays use, obviously those are very different from what we had in earlier centuries or millennia. Back then it was a poor military power which the Iranian dynasties tried to exert, tried to use in order to achieve their goal of reaching the Mediterranean Sea. Nowadays it's obviously again sort of a mixture of military power, soft power, and diplomacy and political pressure, but the idea again it's persists, and it's essentially the same pattern. And then obviously you see the nowadays the projection of the Iranian power to the south of the Arabian Peninsula, mainly the country of Yemen, where Houthis, rebels essentially, which inhabited a very tiny part of this state, which enjoy the support from Iran, but really were not created as a power by the Islamic Republic, as was the case with Hezbollah, for example. So the Iranian leadership tries to use that momentum which was created in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, and Houthis and the Islamic Republic of Iran now sort of work in pair, in concert, essentially in many issues related to security or sort of even global shipping and so on and so on. But the idea here is that it again sort of follows the pattern of previous Iranian dynasties, again trying to reaching to the to more important geographic areas where they would be able essentially to control shipping lanes, trade routes, and in order to exert pressure on their rivals. So if we look at the, for example, the Sasanian dynasty, they too tried to dominate south of the Arabian Peninsula and even part of what back then was the territory across the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, known as Ethiopia. So nowadays Ethiopia doesn't really have a sort of a direct access to the sea, but the idea is the same, that Iran back then in late 6th century, early 7th century, managed to dominate the south of Arabian Peninsula and even tried to infiltrate essentially the African part across the strait. So the goal back then was to control the trade route, which essentially linked the Byzantine Empire or late Roman Empire with the Indian Ocean. Nowadays, we more or less see the same goal. Iran tries to dominate the shipping lanes which connect the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean. The goal obviously is not to, again, not to pressure Byzantine state or the Roman Empire. None of them exist nowadays, but the idea is to pressure the collective West or Israel or any other actor which Iran thinks is against its interests. So the major achievement by the Iranian leadership nowadays is essentially the replication of the pattern which was carried out by the Iranian dynasties back several centuries ago. So I would say that this historical pattern, the persistence of this historical pattern, is again sort of caused by the geographic position of the country, and being at the crossroads of the Eurasian trade routes, the country serves as a connector between several major economic systems, but at the same time the country is not as wealthy, as opulent as its rivals, opponents, and for that reason Iran have always tried to essentially export its power beyond the project its power beyond the geographic barriers of Zagros Mountains, Caspian Sea, or Elbrus Mountains. So that pattern persists to the present day, and it's very likely to persist beyond that too. And we clearly see how geography essentially influences the geopolitics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. To that also should be added the newer trend which we see in the foreign policy of the Iranian leadership, the present Iranian leadership. That's the pivot to the east. So previous dynasties of the Iranian state, they mostly focused on the Mediterranean world, on dominating parts of the Arab Peninsula or South Caucasus, or even some parts of Central Asia. Obviously, they also wanted greater influence in what is nowadays north of India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, but those territories were not geopolitically as important as to the Iran's western borders. So the thing is that economically India was perhaps no less important, if not more important than the trade with the Mediterranean world, but in terms of the military importance, security importance, diplomacy, and soft power, all of that was mostly coming from the western from the territories to the west of Iran, and that's why the Iranian dynasty is mostly focused on the, I would say, where looking westward as the region from where most of the threats, existential threats even, were coming from. So that's obviously not to forget about the threat from the Central Asia, from the barbarians or nomad actors, or later, for example, Uzbek power, or the Afghans, which invaded Iran in early 18th century. But beyond that, still, geopolitics of Iran was mostly focused to the west of the country. And we see nowadays that sort of a significant shift is taking place from a very long-term historical perspective, that Iran now is more actively looking eastward to Asia as a source of finance, trade, resources, and simply geopolitical power. Reasons vary for sure, but perhaps that's the rise of Asia as a whole that causes this shift, which is not only characteristic to Iran, but also very much peculiar to Russia's, Turkey's, and other Eurasian actors' geopolitics at present times. So this shift to Asia is in a way an attempt to balance Iran's sort of focus on the West, collective West, on the Mediterranean world, and so on and so on. This obviously is a very new development, and it's very hard to say how that will sort of play out in the longer term. But one thing is for sure, that with its pivot to the east, sort of imbalance in foreign policy of Iran might emerge, where sort of the focus on the west might be entirely sort of replaced by focus to the east. So to maintain the balance between the two, Iran will need to show sort of a very powerful diplomacy, perhaps, and very effective diplomacy in terms of maintaining balance between two major economic forces. One is Asia, another is collective West.